So my name is Samantha. So I do see myself somewhat as Southeast Asian because our region has had a huge, long, crazy, ridiculous history of movement. A lot of movement, a lot of mixing, a lot of cultural and ancestral knowledge that's just been sort of mixed together, and there's no real need actually to separate that. And so new things constantly emerge. So this is the Southeast Asia that I know and I'm part of, and I want to be involved in curating that and helping it to grow and to become even more diverse. So I'm calling you now from Metro Manila in the Philippines. And I've been here, this is my first time here. I've been here for over 14 months now, and 13 of those months have been in lockdown. So that's where I am. I'm currently in self-isolation actually because I just moved to this place. So not wanting to infect anyone in case I have some remnant of COVID on me. But yeah, that's me. I'm a design strategist in the area of sustainability and regeneration, primarily in the fields of architecture and urban design. Although, of course, a lot of what you can call design applies to anything, organizations, communities, workshops, like facilitation stuff. Really, design needs to be more in spaces of sustainability where we're not currently talking about it. I think that's one of the ways in which we can try to really attach complexity to the work that needs to be done.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, what exactly does design strategy mean?
Yeah, I think design strategy means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but ultimately it comes down to what is the point of what we're doing here, and how can we align the main objectives. Not in saying that a main objective should be how many people we're impacting or how much carbon we are sequestering into the ground. I don't mean that kind of objective. I mean an objective such as, why are we doing this work? Is it to fulfill ourselves, which is also fine, or is it to fulfill something greater than ourselves? Which means we also need to then define and understand that. And the reason why it's important to go into a strategic point of view with regards to a lot of this stuff is because when you get down to metrics and what you're measuring, that defines essentially how your work is then perceived and the effects of that being followed through for not just the duration of the project, but years to come as well. For any sort of, I'm talking about built environment projects specifically, but I think this can apply and in huge degrees across, when we're talking supply chains, for example, or systems change, whatever we're actually approaching in terms of a perspective. And if we're not careful to design around the perspectives that we're approaching with, then you get a lot of vested interests. You get a lot of, especially, I guess, when the default is capitalism, you get a lot of extractive methodologies being applied without much thinking, simply because this is the way that we've done it just now. Rather than something that actually shifts us into a different mode of operation that fits us better into the ecosystems that we actually find ourselves in.
Yeah, so there's a lot of just business as usual going on, right? And people kind of unconsciously choosing profit as their motive unless it's done consciously. Is that what you mean?
I don't even know if it's conscious or unconscious anymore. I think it's simply that we are stuck in a particular alleyway of cultural evolution that blinds us from all of the other possibilities that are available to us. Especially when you think about somebody who is successful, that all that really means is that they know one way to make profit, and usually that is monetary profit. And because they know that way, they'll keep doing that way. And if they're seen as successful by other people as well, then that is the narrow alleyway that people will try to follow through, ignoring all of the other possibilities of success.
And talking about figuring out the why behind it, what is your main motivation for going into this work?
I think the main motivation for me is actually to dissolve myself. I talk about ego death a lot, and I think this is a process that everyone has to go through alone and together. And the reason why I think ego death is so important is because when you look at the systems underpinning capitalism, patriarchy, all the senses of international development and inherent global hegemony, it all comes back down to the ego, to how we pander to humanity essentially, or a certain type of humanity, not even all of humanity, a certain type of human being held at the top of the hierarchy where everyone else has their place in this pyramid. So I think ultimately when we talk about our place, moving from a sense of egocentric to ecocentric, which is something that we talk a lot about in regeneration, is essentially having to, on the one hand, kill the ego, and on the other hand, curate or steward the environment around us in order to actually build that thriving ecosystem. And so for me, the work I think mostly that I have to do, and I think a lot of people that I'm working with are doing, is ego death. And the way that we do that is to practice. So this is an innovation, to practice many different ways of how we can continually embody that ego death through the projects that we're actually bringing to practice. And those projects have very core goals, such as, so when I talk about objectives before, the goals of our projects are usually around how is this actually benefiting ecosystem services on the planet? If we cannot find a way to actually link the activities of this project to the ecosystem services of the planet, then why are we really doing it?
Yeah, and I feel that a lot of people would go through some mental gymnastics and cognitive dissonance at that point in order to still do it, right? For some, like you said, to fit into some version of success that they had. So what are some of the ways that you're able to work towards ego death?
I think part of it is this heritage confusion that I pointed to when I introduced myself. I think most people on the planet experience heritage confusion because of our history of colonization. This intermixing of, often forced intermixing, right? From military intervention and slavery, etc. Continues to this day, by the way, it hasn't stopped. And so this cultural heritage is sort of the largest, most ignored blind spot in helping us reach ego death. Oftentimes we don't know, like for example, I don't know where my grandparents came from. To be fair, I don't even know who my grandparents are, like, let alone where they came from or who they married or who they had children with. And this story is the same right across a lot of the global south, for example, particularly so in Southeast Asia because of our history of intermixing anyway. And so I think looking back into who we are and trying to refine our identities instead of what Western globalization tries to tell us our identity is, if that makes sense, is, I think, the bulk of the work that we need to be doing. And when we start to understand where we come from and where we fit actually in human society, the hope is that we can also try to understand where we fit in our greater natural ecosystems as well. And you're right about the dissonance. There's a lot of work to do, a lot of personal, almost traumatic things to go into, because for a lot of white folks, their history is colonization. And there's a lack of, I guess, enthusiasm around wanting to connect with or own it as part of their identities. Whereas for us in the global south, we don't have a choice except to own our histories of oppression. We don't have anywhere to go because it faces us every single day. And so this understanding of ourselves is, I think, one of the fundamental layers that needs to happen, and is the bulk of the work that I think is crucial within planetary regeneration. The next level to that, and probably happening in parallel, is building connection. So we're talking about not connection as in let's reinforce hierarchies by getting in touch with people on the other side of the planet, but rather connection in the sense of listening, empathy, understanding. I don't even want to talk about compassion, because so many people, apply compassion in a completely different sense, which is typically philanthropic. And we have, there's all sorts of problems with philanthropy that actually espouses global hegemony, etc., that is a very complicated and complex, unsafe and dangerous way to go about building connection. But rather, I think building connection from a space of understanding and learning, I think, is the way to go. And there are a few, I guess, institutes or organizations who are trying to figure this out. You know, they're sort of playing around with this Rubik's Cube and trying to understand what to then put in place and how we can do that. But nobody's ever thinking about it from the point of view of ego death either. So there are these huge gaps, I guess, in what I see, what my friends and I see, and those are the things that we're trying to work towards to build or design, I guess, and conduct little experiments here and there to try and improve on those designs to see what's actually going to work for obviously a particular type of community or a particular type of people, because design has to keep going on every time we come across like a new set of parameters or a new context.
There's a lot of projects I see that you're involved with at the moment. I see a lot of stuff on LinkedIn and your Instagram, for example. So I don't know if I'd ask you about all of them, but can you tell me about one of the things that you're involved with at the moment?
Sure, I'd love to talk about possible futures because I think it touches upon a lot of the things that I've brought up. So Possible Futures is a creative dialogic project where we're aiming to bring together people to have conversations and then to have interactive discussions as part of those conversations to be able to really dig into the issues that we're covering. And the issues that we're covering are around what does it take to regenerate the Global South? The Global South, I probably should explain, is called the Global South because of the existence of the Global North. The Global North are, geographically speaking, relatively mostly in the north, but it doesn't mean that it's a geographic term, right? It also is a metaphorical term. And what this sort of points to is histories of colonization, where the Global North economies or nations have consistently been the ones to, because of essentially military technology, take over, enslave, and colonize large swathes of the Global South. And that is the reason why we have first world countries. That is the reason why we have third world countries. That is the reason why we have the UNHCR, or why we have charities such as Save the Children, etc. And so there's a lot of broken relationships in that global relationship between the North and the South. One of the ways that the Global North extends control over the Global South is divide and conquer. This is a very popular and common way to colonize peoples, which is to separate them and to almost point out, using a lot of heavy propaganda, the differences between them to set them against each other. So on the grand scheme of things, this is essentially the pattern that the Global North, mainly it's America and Europe, mainly Europe, who have been trying to point out differences between Global South countries and saying, you guys get these resources, you guys don't, because this is what happened in your history, and maybe you've had a history of communism, for example, in the case of Vietnam, which we're trying to eradicate for whatever ideological reason that we want to impose on you because we have a superior method of political design. And so because of a lot of these ways of dividing peoples, the Global South has never really, over the last 500 years, never really had opportunities to rebuild relationships between each other. Whereas when you talk about pre-colonial societies, we had really diverse trade routes and we had very interconnected, intermixed cultures, which was based on mutual respect. And it was the safest that international trade had ever been, before essentially the Portuguese came into the Indian Ocean and started pirating and forcing people to buy their wool when we're in Asia and nobody needs any wool. So I think Possible Futures as a project aims to rebuild those connections between Global South peoples, particularly because every time we come together and talk about some of the issues of oppression that we currently face today and trace it back, going all the way to the first peoples being decimated by the first colonizers who arrived, And this is something that I think is so much part of our history that we almost are trained to ignore now because of the education system, because of, you know, the ways to get opportunity within your country, etc. And how, for example, in the Philippines and in many other nations in the global south, it's very common for young people to say a better life is outside of my country. So there's all of these narratives, all of these stories that are so similar across the global south that we actually don't realize, and we almost take for granted that, oh, it's just us. This is a problem just because we are like this. When in reality it's a systemic problem, and the system comes from global hegemony. So when we come together to be able to have these dialogues, it opens up that awareness. For example, every time we have a conversation, we have someone from Latin America, someone from Africa, and at least one person from Asia to be in that conversation to talk about the topic of whatever we're discussing that day. And when you see the connections being made, it becomes a very special place. It becomes not a place of trying to, I guess, be competitive around who is more oppressed, but rather a place of seeing the patterns and understanding how solidarity needs to actually start to form by creating this sort of, I wouldn't even say community, I would say a relationship. And so that's the importance for us for Possible Futures. And I'm working with an amazing team of collaborators in Latin America, Africa, and also in Asia. And they're all women who are intergenerational. And it's really inspiring just to be a part of this project where we can actually discuss these issues and how it affects our lives as we are processing ourselves cultural heritage confusion, while noticing how the system perpetuates itself on the global stage. So that would be Possible Futures. And if you're interested, you can look up more at possiblefutures.earth.
Great. I was curious when you said that they're all women. Is that by design, or is it that just more women are drawn into this work? Because I've noticed the same thing in a lot of these spheres. I'm wondering, yeah, the added layer of patriarchy on top of that, maybe to deal with.
I think for a lot of when we talk about like women getting into positions of power, we forget that patriarchy is in our minds. It's not in our wombs. Like, so I would be careful about how, I guess, we think about whether patriarchy is being enforced just because a woman is in a position, in a decision-making position, for example. But with regards to my team, the way I work, and this is also part of my personal design strategy, I work with emergence and I work with diversity in a way. But I don't mean diversity in the sense of this person is from Brazil, this person is from India. I mean diversity in the sense of our backgrounds and the way that we think because of that. So neurodiversity is the top most important thing for me when kind of pulling together or seeing what is coming together as a team. And most of the time, you don't even need to actively design for it. It's simply energies that get drawn together because of the work that we all feel passionate about and that we all feel is important enough to put time and energy into it. So those people have tended to be women. That's what I have found in, I guess, my adult life. And I would say as well, those people have tended to be women with a very particular slant of wanting, you know, there's this yearning to understand the greater world that we live in. So it's not just any women, of course, but I think it's this sense of wanting to know who I am on a very deep level, wanting to know how am I being human. So for me, that's how we come together. And that's not just how I see it, it's also how everyone on my team sees it. And so because of that, that is the common denominator that sticks us together, if that makes sense. And everybody has different skill sets and different, you know, everything is just magically complementary and everything just comes together. And it's just, I have no idea how it happens. And I'd like to think that this is also how other women would like to go about, you know, doing projects. And I think ultimately when we're talking about regeneration, inner regeneration is equally like 50% a part of the story as it is outer regeneration. So if it's something that is not actually helping you to kill your ego or to find out what kind of human you actually are, it's not really a worthwhile project, feminine or not. And I do think that that is where we're going. And I have seen and met many men as well who are trying to do the same work. But for some reason, men don't tend to want to do that kind of work together. That's what I understand, whereas women are. And I think this simply feeds into the ways that our brains are wired and how we socialize, and yeah, it's down to biology, I would say.
Yeah. So just on the topic of regeneration, can you say a bit more about, what does regeneration mean to you?
I think there's many different levels of what that means. I've spoken about inner and outer regeneration. I think when we talk about planetary regeneration, what that means to me is the healing of relationships between the global north and the global south. Nothing happens until that happens. We can't talk about Paris Agreement until we talk about reparations, for example. So for me, regeneration is as much about food sovereignty as it is about economic oppression, as it is about philanthropy, as it is about education, as it is about health and well-being, as it is about designing cities. And I think ultimately it's about our ego. That's really what has gotten out of control right now. And if we can find a way to design towards those sorts of experiments and objectives, then I think we can call that approaching regeneration.
So for the people who are watching this in the global north, is there any direction you'd really like to direct them in, or anything you'd like to say?
Yes, absolutely. The fundamental thing that I think global north folk should be really actively looking into as a form of resistance, as a form of activism, in order to stand in solidarity with the global south, the fundamental thing, I think, is to seek systems change where you are. Many companies that are based in the global south are actively extracting global south resources. And that is mainly because of the permission that has been given by global north companies and governments to be able to do that as well. So it starts from the policies that are in government and in corporate, and how we can seek to change those things for real equality. And I don't mean equality in terms of hiring practices within those firms, but equality in terms of how we are actually managing or managing physical resources, human resources, as well as ecosystem services. How are we actually being accountable to the planet through the way that we act as corporations and governments? So for people listening in the global north, my suggestion is to look into how we can decolonize corporate policy, government policy, international trade policy, and that can be very, very easily done where you are already by simply being an active citizen in democracy. So this is my biggest suggestion for people in the global north who actually want to be a part of the help for the global south, instead of, for example, donating to the UN World Food Program. If we simply decolonize our trade policies when it comes to agricultural products, we won't need the World Food Program.
Yeah. So it's looking at the root, not just putting the Band-Aid on at the end, right? Yeah. Okay, great. I'm just looking at the time, so I guess we'll wrap up there. So thank you so much for talking to me today.
Not at all. Thank you.